We're at the Danforth Museum of Art. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Very special night for our ledger art conversation. I'm going to do the introductions and thank yous, and then I'll explain just a little bit about what's happening in the room, and then we'll get to talking with the people who really matter. I want to thank Rob Forstenser for sponsoring this event this evening. Sponsorship helped bring these fine folks all the way from Helena and Billings and parts beyond, so quite a bit of travel involved. Want to mention upcoming next month, after this show comes down on the 17th, we have Stephen Noble, an artist who has a studio here above Saxon Friar doing some very modernist, minimalist types of work. Stark contrast to the lusciousness that we have here, but it's very interesting. I want to point out that we are streaming on Facebook tonight, and we are recording it, fingers crossed, and we will post it on YouTube later, so you'll be able to watch it if you or your friends weren't able to see the stream. We also have a presence at thedanforth.org. That's our website, the Danforth, and links to all the social media stuff. We also have an Instagram page, so click, like, join, all those good things. If any of you are so moved, we have a ledger, a logbook, I should say, over here, and Susan would be happy to sign you up for some volunteer work. Sitting in the gallery is one of the big ones, hosting to keep the doors open, because so much of what we do is by invite, and we need those doors to be open more than they are. So if you can spare some time, even once a month, that would be lovely. We are also experimenting with, I wasn't able to get it all together for tonight, but I have scanned the room for a 3D virtual tour where you'll be able to go online and click on each one of these and get a close-up look, a higher resolution look, so you can sort of walk through the gallery a little bit. That's going to be cool. And then I took care of all of that. Okay, so very quickly, in the room tonight, on this side, we have antique ledgers from the 1880s, drawn by people like Medicine Crow and, Plenty Coups. Thank you. Jeez Louise. Because I didn't write it down. There's a whole history behind those that's fascinating. They're on loan from MSU Billings Library. The university was so kind to just, as long as I came to pick them up and showed that we had insurance, they would lend them to us. They were fantastic. Over on this side, the Dwayne Wilcox in particular, and the Chris Pappan, the big one there, and the one in the corner, those are on loan from the Missoula Art Museum. So we want to thank those guys for sharing their ledger art with us. What that ends up doing is showing us what happened in the 19th century, how people like Dwayne started picking it up and running with it in the 90s and on into the 2000s. And then we have Holly Young back there. We have Ben Pease, who's joining us tonight. We have some DG House, who's from over in Bozeman. And the world premiere, sort of, we have Evan Thompson's piece here. If you could just, let's just turn that so everyone can see. We'll be talking about this piece. He made this for the Teepee Village down in Gardner this summer and brought it up to share with us tonight. Really cool story behind that. And then we're also being joined by Emerson Bullchief, who's the academic dean at Little Bighorn College. So, without further ado, gentlemen, come on up. We have Ben Pease. Come and join us. Emerson Bullchief, Evan Thompson. I'm going to sit there. All right. I'm going to hold on to this one for just a little bit. Is my water there? No, down low. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. I don't have a set of questions, but I do want to tie the conversation, center it on the art that is here. Two of you are artists. Emerson, you said, I don't know anything about art, but you know a lot about oral storytelling traditions and the history of the Crow. So I'm eager to get into that and use that as the foundation for where we're going, because ultimately everything that we do here in this room right now is storytelling. How about we start a little bit like we were talking before the show this evening about drawing the line from rock art to bison art into the early ledger art. If you could explain the role, perhaps, that the marks that were made on rock, the paintings made on hide played in storytelling, and then maybe a little bit of the history. Yep.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, a lot of indigenous cultures here in the U.S. didn't have a written language. A lot of it was kept through oral tradition. So people would remember stories and pass it on to the next generation to be able to tell the story or events that have happened in the past. And so with that ideology then came with putting it on rock or on stone. So you'll see various tribes have do a lot of the pictographs and a lot of the rock art that were events that have happened, like enemies that were fought or along those lines. And the different tribes have different ways of doing that artwork. So you can't just go to a place and say, oh, it's rock art, and assign it to all the tribes. And like with the Crow people, I know that a lot of the artwork, they have the V shape. And so when you see any rock art where there's like a V at the neck, those are more than likely Crow people. And then eventually, of course, they were with the tan hides. They were writing, drawing their art on there to explain events, to explain the year, what has happened, how many enemies were killed, or something along those lines. So, and then that's as far as I'll go. Let these guys talk about ledger art, because I'm not an artist.
Excellent. Ben, you want to pick it up, or Evan? Go ahead, Evan. I'm going to hand this to you so that you can jump in whenever you like. Yeah, so what is it that, looking for what kind of images are made in ledger art and for what purpose? Is it just to make a pretty picture?
Well, I think, historically, it was meant to tell a story, like Emerson said, a war record. So, once the things that would have been historically kept painted on hide, on buffalo hides, on war shirts, on teepees, those images, once the reservation era hits and there's a scarcity of hide, buffalo are disappearing, people would go to forts or any other sources where they could find some paper to leave this history, this personal war record or history for their families, for posterity, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like some of these older legends, that's what's going on in the late 1800s. And so, but with contemporary ledger art, I think it's morphed beyond just telling a story of war records, right? I mean, it's become more of purely aesthetic pieces for some artists. Some artists continue to tell stories with their ledger art. What would have historically been done by men leaving a war record, now it's done by both men and women are creating lots of beautiful ledger pieces. So, I think in this day and age, you can't really pigeonhole it as one thing. It's really become much broader than that.
Yeah, what I really appreciate is where a lot of people are taking it. So one way is to look at it stylistically and look at what you've done, Ben, with your painting back in the corner there, where you're layering on tops of comic book images and things that aren't technically ledgers. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that, how you feel the freedom to take the form in that direction?
Yeah, thank you guys all for coming tonight, by the way. I'd also like to say I'm sitting here with Emerson and Evan. Emerson is he's a preeminent historian in our tribe, Evan is an attorney and an artist and many other things. And I am pleased to be here and honored that you all showed up. I have a story, my life. There's been a path that I've followed. Not saying that it's been set out for me, but it's a story nonetheless. Just as everybody here has their own story, right? And that's just much the same as a function as ledger art is. I guess it's telling not only the story of battles, war deeds, it's telling of personal human experiences, right? Because these things, like if you're telling the story of a battle, this was part of our life. This was part of our society, the way that we lived. This was our world. Now imagine aliens come down right now as we're all sitting here, and they get out of their spaceship and they come in here and they say, hey, your world is now changed. You believe in what we believe in, you live how we live, etc. You study, you learn how we learn. That's what happened to our people, right? And this is one of the ways that we evolved in keeping our histories and our stories alive, right? This was a tool that we used to stay alive, right? And just the same, you look over right in the middle, there's a drawing with some people in red blankets. On there, there's a scene of a courtship between two individuals. And that's a beautiful thing, and you don't really see that very often, but that's one of our forms of humanness that has been documented on what is now a historical artifact, right? That being said, personally, I don't feel like our work as natives or even work as artists can be taken away from your life as a human. You cannot separate your humanness and your artwork, your creativity. And as a native artist or an artist who happens to be Native American simultaneously, you cannot separate culture and art. There's no space in between that for me, in my understanding of it. You cannot take it apart. And so part of my story is what I'm telling on these two works back here in the corner of my great-great-great-grandfather, and some of the thoughts that I've had around that, what it means to be an artist today. Why am I even painting in oils and acrylics if I'm part of the defeated race, the vanishing race? And next to the painting is a little tiny check that has a rendition of his son's war rifles. They're a Thunderbird rifle. Anyways, yeah, just continuing my story, not trying to paint pretty pictures just because I know I can make some money at it. Trying to really think about what it means to be indigenous and an artist today in where we live.
I'm curious, Emerson, if that's any of what they've said has triggered anything in you, the historian.
So the historian, my last name is Bull Chief. That painting is of Bull Chief. But it's as far as the history goes, my family didn't come from Bull Chief. Bull Chief had a son that was killed in battle and shot in the hand, which is my great-great-grandfather, had a son who Bull Chief adopted and made that boy his own. And so that was where I came from, was shot in the hand. But because of that adoption, which we do a lot in our culture, we adopt in a lot of ways. That's where how I ended up with the last name, even though I'm not from that family. And so I know we discussed this before, Ben, about why my last name is Bull Chief, and we're not blood related, but
Maybe I'll change my name to Bull Chief.
There you go. And I'll change mine to shot in the hand. So, but that's how those names went. And I know when we started having to have Christian names, we were actually my culture were matrilineal, and so we should have been using our mother's names and so on, but we didn't. We take our mother's clan. I belong to the same clan as my mother. So why couldn't I keep her last name, along those lines? But of course, the dominant culture said, "Oh, you're going to take the male's last name," and so here we are.
Any other thoughts before I move on? I want to do a little bit of compare and contrast with that cultural setting. There are some art historical themes that are running that are just interesting to look at stylistically, but I think that they sort of expand into wider meaning. Some of the easy grabs are the depiction of hooves on animals, and you can see that John Pepion, who works on is behind us, the way that he's drawing his hooves here are very similar to what we see on, especially on that bison hunt down below on that wall over there. And this is where, if I had the pictures on Matterport, it would be easier for you guys to see at home. But it's interesting to see how modern artists are reaching back and borrowing some of these stylistic features, but also some of the themes, like the courtship. And then over here we have Dwayne Wilcox on one of them with one called Get a Teepee Already, which with the people with the blanket over them. So there's a lot of cultural reference there that's also sort of a, well, in a general audience becomes a little bit of an inside joke in a way, but I think that what I find interesting about what Dwayne is doing over here is establishing the modern existence and experience, the modern lived experience of modern Native life. Do you guys have any thoughts about that and how representation changes the way you see yourself or the way others see you?
Well, I think to answer your question about representation, I have to think back into time and thinking about how some of these drawings were taken from larger volumes, larger books that were like these guys' journals, so they could remember, so they could share, so they could take record of what had happened to them on their trips or whatever, came in front of them. But these drawings were cut out of a larger book and then sold, right? Sold to private collectors, mostly, sold to institutions secondarily, and then just that created a market. And I think a lot of it was spurred on by the Enlightenment, because they were created 1850s, there's some stories about raids and massacres and going into teepees and finding these ledger drawings, and them finding them at trading posts. And there's historical trading post locations all around us through this valley, through the next valley into Bozeman, down to Yellowstone, they're everywhere. And so then there was the beginning of a market, right? They were considered as a valuable. And that being said, because that was spurred on by somewhat of the Enlightenment, they started to be kept and taken care of by ethnographers, anthropologists, sociologists, scientists, all kinds of educators, because the West was leaving us, right? The Indians were going away, not to return, and so let's keep this thing for future reference. And thinking about what happened after that, it was sort of turned into a fetishization, if that's right. Fetishization. And as we look into today, we're literally sitting in the heart of the West, and what's popular here are cowboys and Indians and wildlife, right? Those are the main three. There's landscapes, but that's not too far away. And that's what sells, and that's what's on people's walls. That's what people want to match their curtains and their drapes and to put over their fireplaces, right? A little piece of the West. And I think it's important to think about why that's valuable, because of what's happened in this place. All the stories that have been told, lost, forgotten, remembered. It's powerful to realize what's happening right now. We're sitting in this gallery staring at this ledger art from the past to the present to what could be the future, because we live in a story, because we live in an economy of storytelling as well. Stories are valuable. Look around you. Everywhere we look, it has been created by humans. It has a story. So feeling representation as an artist in this place hasn't always been the best. My first show was in this same gallery about 10 or 11 years ago, and my son right here was with me, and we walked outside, and as we were leaving after the show, some guys came out of this establishment next to us, and they started dancing around my son, war whooping. And man, I wanted to plow into them, right? But my wife, she grabbed me and she said, Ben, it's not worth it. And we went to the car and we left. And so thinking about what representation means, especially in a town like this, Livingston, Montana, with the name Livingston, it's a little bit different. But now here I am with my peers, and this is a good thing because we can share our stories and we can tell our own stories now. But anyways. Yeah.
I agree. Representation is vastly important. I mean, it just brings awareness to the fact that I think through our art, we bring awareness to the fact that we are still here. We do have stories to tell, and I think something that sometimes gets lost is that we're still fighting battles in our courts, trying to preserve the rights we have left, the sovereignty we have left, try to expand that where we can. So, you know, we fight those battles politically, legally. So for me as an attorney, as a practicing attorney, I think it's really important that we can speak to people through our art as well, and just, you know, it also humanizes us, and it helps us find not only support from people in the battles we face, but also collaborators, people that are sympathetic to those causes help us, and then, you know, finding middle ground.
Mm-hmm. Evan, could you explain your piece of work here and how it came about, what it means, where it went?
So just a little bit of background. I'm a practicing attorney. I've been practicing law for going on 12 years now. I'm with a firm in Helena, Montana, but the largest part of my practice, I practice in tribal courts across the Northwest. I'm licensed in 14 tribal jurisdictions in Montana and Dakotas and Wyoming. And a large volume of my work is doing work for my tribe, Blackfeet. I'm part of the tribe's legal team. I work with their in-house counsel as general legal counsel for the tribe. And so, you know, from those experiences, I mean, those battles that we're facing in courts, and like I said, politically, you know, I wanted to start putting those stories down on ledger as part of my own personal war record, so to speak. And so I was asked earlier this year to participate in the Yellowstone Revealed project that went on down in the park here last week. And you know, I asked the folks that were putting that on, I said, well, what are you looking for in a piece? Because they wanted me to create something for the event. I said, well, I don't know, just something that speaks to resilience. And so I kind of thought about my experiences with Yellowstone, and one of those was a project that I was part of in 2017. I was part of the legal team, you know, that reasserted our treaty hunting rights in and around the Yellowstone area. And so in 2017, the tribe sent a letter to the state notifying the state that we intended to resume hunting buffalo in the unceded lands around the park. In 2018, we had our first buffalo hunt in probably over 100 years at that point in the areas around the park. And so this piece is what I created inspired by that. The front figure here is he has his war shield, and he's holding up our 1855 Treaty with the United States, the Blackfeet Treaty with the United States. And behind him we have 3 drummers. And then below we have pictographic style hunters and buffalo here representing our resumed hunting in the Yellowstone area.
That's great. Thank you for doing that. And that was reproduced and blown up and put outside of the teepees, is that right?
Yeah, they had a teepee village set up at Madison Junction, it's called Madison Junction, on the west side of Yellowstone there. And so they had a row of teepees, and then leading down to the teepees was a path, and they had this piece as well as 4 other pieces from other native artists here in Montana blown up on 6-foot tall banners.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, I'd also kind of like to think about ledger art and beading as being classified more as a craft and not really considered as an art by museums and by collectors for so many years. And I think it just only recently, with just the sheer number of Native people making ledger art and making beadwork, I think it's one of the fastest growing parts of the art world. And at the same time, you know, I think we're trying to help people redefine what that means and how to value our art and our experience. So this is art, and I think originally it wasn't considered as such, but now I think you're able to really realize what this means, because there's symbology, there's design, there's composition, there's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even with beadwork, it takes a skilled individual who's committed to the art itself to make these things. From these ones to everything that happens, you know. I have a friend who's presently working on the computer and made a virtual ledger horse, and you can see it when you put your phone up and you can walk around it, but it's not there. You put your phone down and it's gone. So it's this thing that we call ledger art is evolving faster than I can even keep a hold on it. So it's going to be interesting to watch and see what happens, what these artists do, what we as artists do. So.
That's like in the, I can't think of it, I want to say virtual reality.
VR, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a VR ledger horse.
Yeah, VR.
That's pretty wild. That's cool.
Do we have any questions yet?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask something just to reference what you just said. So, for most ledger artists, the relationship between the image and the ledger piece, the ledger.
The relationship.
Yeah, I mean, do you
of the
ledger? Does the ledger influence the image?
It does and it doesn't. It's all up to the artist. It's very highly individualistic. So personally, I've chosen specific pieces of paper due to their context, because it came out of Montana, because it was maybe from the Bureau of whatever, you know, based on my idea. Or if it came from a certain ranch that comes from where crows inhabited mostly, I chose that. But then there's other times where I just used whatever was laying on the floor because that's what was closest. Because it's a substrate, you know, it can carry context and weight to it. But for me, anymore nowadays, it's the substrate that I get to work on, like the canvas. But other artists, like one of my friends, Robert Martinez, he chooses like a contemporary document that's based on census records, right, from just a few years ago. So it varies.
Yeah, I was going to mention to somebody who said it earlier too, that after when we got to the reservation days and we couldn't go out hunting anymore, there was no more hide to use, so they would find those discarded ledgers and they would just take that as their, like Ben was saying, you know, there's a piece of paper right here, I'm going to use it to draw my war record on, or my history on it, or my understanding of the world on this document, or whatever is just laying here.
And like Ben said, I mean, you know, it's really to the individual, right? How that relationship between the paper and the art is. But I mean, for myself personally, I try to select paper that I can find that has some kind of connection to the vision I have for the art piece. So one example that would have been a couple years ago, I had a piece in this multinational exhibit called Extraction, and it was commenting on oil and gas development and that, and extraction of minerals and the impacts that was having. And so, I dug through my pile of paper and I found a ledger from an oil and gas company. It was like an oil and gas tax receipt from a company that was operating in Montana in the 20s. And so, I specifically chose that piece of paper to create a piece commenting on oil extraction from. So, I think it does, and then not just the subject matter of the paper, but also sometimes the placement, because with ledgers that have been written in, they have various handwriting elements to them, different markings and that kind of thing. And so sometimes I try to take elements from the writing and incorporate it into the design of the piece.
Yeah. So does it matter if we call something, can we call it ledger art even if it's made on comic books or, receipts or checks or things that are, or almost blank paper on some of this old stuff?
Or a map.
Or a map. Yeah, does it matter what we call it?
Does it matter? What matters anymore, really? But I think it is interesting to think about what they were talking about as a product of being kept on the reservation, penned in like livestock, because you weren't able to hunt anymore, like Emerson said. But even before that, the death of the buffalo, people killing the buffalo, exterminating the buffalo, only because they were at such high numbers because there were less natives on the land. The main predator of the bison was taken away, anywhere from 100 million to 60 million and bison killed, but that was just because of another reason. And so all this has happened. Ledger art, we're sitting amongst it because of all that, our past. And what's going to happen and what's it going to change into? So,
Well, that VR horse is amazing. I hadn't heard about that yet. That's
Gail.
Question, Evan, could you share with us the beauty of the flowers and then those standing headdresses?
Yeah, so stand-up headdresses are Blackfeet style headdresses. Sometimes you'll see a lot of headdresses that are Sioux style that have their sloping back, but Blackfeet, this is our traditional style of headdress, and often they're decorated with like beautiful pelts, and so that's what's hanging down on these three headdresses. Floral patterns are really common in native art, especially plains beadwork and contemporary art. And so I always try to incorporate floral elements into many of my pieces. But in this particular piece, I did these stylized, almost a tulip style flower, but they start small and they get bigger. To me, that was representative of growth. And so I felt that as part of this piece, in this particular story, it's just one step in our growth, regaining ground.
Thank you.
Tracy?
This is actually a question for all three of you. But Ben, you said that these pieces over here on the right-hand side of the wall are pieces that were most likely taken out of a book or a journal. And so I've been hearing a lot about Native American pieces of art in the world of all kinds of things being given back to the tribes. And there's a case right now, I think in either South Dakota or North Dakota, and the governor said it's going to take a few years to get everything back to the tribe, which I don't really understand that. But do you see that kind of thing happening with these kinds of pieces, that they will be given back to the tribes that they came from so that they can be put back into that ownership?
That is a very good question, but also a very tough one to answer. I spoke about the same subject when I was in D.C. about a month ago at the Kennedy Center for this big celebration. I went on stage with Dr. Rick West, he's done a lot of things in Native country for Native art and law, and we talked about this same issue with the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act and its implications and its definitions, especially with everything happening now. There's so many things that are moving back to tribes that can demonstrate that they can take care of it. And I'd probably defer more context to these two gentlemen because they know a bit more about it than I do. But at the same time, I've been contacted by multiple museums saying, hey, we have some of your family's things. We'd like you to come look at them. We'd like to give them back. But how does that happen? What are the venues that you have to take legally to make that happen? Because it's an asset, right, which carries value. And there's so many other things that you need to pay attention to. And if, like I said earlier, our art cannot be extracted away from our beings as humans, then what am I doing as an artist selling my paintings to whosoever says, here's some cash, smell it, And I've asked Rick West the same question. Will artists today, will our work be rematriated or repatriated to their tribes respectively or not? Will they be continued to be considered assets or not? And he didn't have a good answer. And mind you, he was very, very instrumental in founding the museum in Washington, D.C., National Museum of the American Indian. Very instrumental. And if he didn't know it, then who would, right? And so, short story, I was on eBay like 3 or 4 months ago, and I was scrolling and scrolling because that's where I find some of my paper things. If you've found things on eBay, I found like these records that are old Indian records, not old, but they're from the 70s. But they're of some old-time songs that were Crow. And when I first got them, I listened to them. They're faster, they're higher pitched, they're different, a different sound than what is being sung today in our celebrations. So there's an evolution there too. But in looking for things, I found my great-great-grandfather's leggings, some of his personal articles. And I messaged the seller. I said, hey, these are ours. I'd like to find a way, because I'm an artist, I can trade you a painting or something. And he said, I'll just send them to you. And he had a price tag like $3,000, $3,500 on them. And I wasn't about to pay that unless I had to. But he just sent me a message yesterday morning saying that he'd gift them to our family, and they're in the mail to arrive probably tomorrow. So, interesting thoughts. But NAGPRA, could you guys...
Well, NAGPRA, the Repatriation Act opened the door for Native Americans to receive items that were taken, and so within that law, it's basically saying that if you receive federal funding, if you're a museum, university that has Indian items, Native American items, that if especially like burial items, sacred items, items of family patrimony, or items that belong to the entire tribe, you can get those repatriated. So there's been a lot of instances where human remains have been repatriated to different tribes, depending on the tribe. Like for us as Crow people, we do not handle human remains. It's taboo for us. And so what we've done in the past, when I was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer in Crow, we would have the county coroner, wherever the human remains were, to rebury them. And as far as like family patrimony, there's multiple items that are out there that belong to my family. Plenty Coups war bonnet at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I'm a direct descendant of Plenty Coup. He didn't have any children of his own, and neither did his brother, but his sister goes well, which is where I come from. That's our family, and that is our item. But they've been asking if we could repatriate it, and where are we going to put it? You know, that's always the issue, is like, what kind of, you have to take care of these things in the right climate and everything, and most tribes don't have museums, don't have that facility to be able to house and curate certain items, and so they just sit there. But they're waiting. A lot of these museums, a lot of these universities are willing to give back items, but nobody's willing to take them at the moment unless we have these facilities built. So that's all I can say about NAGPRA, just my own experience from it.
To be 100% honest, it's pretty far from my personal expertise, but my general understanding of that is that ledger art would likely fall outside of the definition of things that can be repatriated. But that's not to say that in the future Congress might expand that to open it up to those types of things. But as of right now, I don't think it fits.
I think it can fit in a way where, like, let's say, like that drawing that Plenty Coup has up there. I could go to MSUB and say, well, you know, just telling you my lineage, that I'm from Goswell, that's my family's item, I want it back. They will, because they are receiving federal dollars, they have to repatriate it back to me. So there's that option as a family, you know, within that family patrimony. Under that particular Mr. Legal Mind, I don't know what they would call that. Under that particular part of the law, I could use that to get that piece back, but I won't, because I have nowhere to put it.
And I think with that comment, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are certain pieces that carry much more weight, much more significance than, you know, certain other ones. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you could get creative with those arguments.
Yeah, and I could say, yeah, it's family patrimony, it belongs to my family, I want it back, and we could do that because they receive federal dollars. You always got to look for that, federal dollars.
Susan?
First, I want to say all three of you just said some really fascinating things to me for the last 45 minutes. I want to change it slightly. You all alluded to the fact that rock art, hide art, ledger art is basically a warrior art form, something that men did. And now women are doing it too, and I'd like to change this. I'd like to know what this means. How do you feel challenged by this? What differences do you see between what men are doing and what women are doing? Are the stories similar? Are the stories different? Are materials different? You're laughing at me.
No.
We're laughing at each other here.
Okay.
I gave him a microphone.
What are the differences here? How is this manifesting?
Yeah, anyways. Historically, men most likely would paint shields. Men would most likely do rock art and do hide art, but not always. You know, all of our tribes have stories of both genders, and that was sort of something that was taken by the people writing the books, right, and generalized. And they said that, like, even the women's art was making parfleche. The women's art was keeping the home and the family, but that really varied really highly by tribe. There were many, many, many women warriors in every tribe and women leaders in every tribe, and there still are. But thinking about, for me, at least with what I've read and been told and taught, is that the incoming culture, Christianity, Western culture, Western Indo-European culture, had an effect that was so strong that it changed our gender roles. It flipped them, and it made them more of a detriment to us than an actual tool of society for us, as far as I can understand. And so that the question is problematic because you're initially assigning gender roles to it. And when we had roles, they weren't always genderized, you know. And even into today, there's men and women doing this, and there's no right or wrong, you know. There's not a lot of implications unless you're drawing something that is taboo in your own tribe and your own family, something you're not allowed to do. Then people know it. If it's kind of one of those things, if you know, then you know, you know.
And I'd say, you know, echoing on that is, you know, for Black people, we have historic women's warrior societies. And so, I mean, my comment initially is generally, yes, it was more commonly being done by men, but it's not to say that it was exclusively being done by men. And so, I mean, it would not, I don't know of any specific examples, but it wouldn't shock me to find, you know, that there are war art was being historically created by women. And I think it's great that it's, you know, now being ledger art in its modern form is being done by everyone, so.
Well, if you think about it too, and anthropologically, if you look at all of the indigenous cultures here in the U.S. and probably around the world, the idea of homosexuals is not a bad thing in ours, because we accepted people who chose to be the opposite sex. So both men, there was men that decided to be women, and they were accepted, and there was women that wanted to be warriors and war leaders, and that was acceptable. And so in that level of acceptance in our community, in the world that we understood, of course Christianity came in and said, no, you can't have none of that. And so today, people at our age, we look down. I mean, there's a lot of people that look down on the homosexuals that are, you know, within our culture. But if as a true Crow practitioner and follower of my belief ways, I accept them all. Like whoever you are, you're going to be accepted here in my world. But I know my Christian counterparts who are on the reservation, they put that down. They put me down for believing in who I am as a Native. So it's just being able to understand that those ways were accepted in the past and that they should be accepted today.
That was excellent non-mansplaining. You guys did a good job. But I wanted to ask you, Ben and Evan, as artists, and from what you said about the being penned in, makes me think of, I work with kids, what kids do in school on their ledgers. Did you in school write on, draw, create your art on your notebooks and over things? It doesn't seem similar to you, because that's when you said that, so my mind instantly went to all my daughter's drawings all over her notebooks for school.
Yeah, all I ever wanted to do in school was draw and talk to girls and draw. And that's what I did, and I'm still doing it, unfortunately. I also in school I drew little cutouts of the ships of Columbus, Santa Maria, you know, etc. And that was always interesting because I had never really known, even growing up in Montana and learning Montana Indian history because of Indian education for all as a state mandate. I didn't really learn anything. Even learning about Indians, I didn't learn anything, which is interesting, you know. And in my travels, like I went to Germany a few years ago to follow some of my German heritage for my grandmother, to really find out what my German side looked like, where we came from. So I went to the town where my great-great-grandmother was born. I met the mayor, and I gave talks on what is an Indian, was ist ein Indianer. And to every talk, I think I've told some of you before, to every talk there'd be these hobbyists that would show up dressed in full garb, like war shirt and pants and feathers. The women would come in dresses, and they'd get mad when I'd talk about what an Indian really is, a Native American, indigenous person. And I had one of them, he got so mad at me that he stood up and he berated me in German and he walked out. And it was an interesting time to me because it took me back through all my years in school. And so I asked, hey, can I go to some schools? And so I went to these schools, these elementary schools, middle schools, and I gave talks about what is an Indian. And at every school I went to, it was Indian Day. Every time I showed up, mind you, it was like a series of 4 days, and they all had Indian Day. Anyways. But when I walk in, you know, all these kids would have fake Indian garb on and feathers, chicken feathers, and cardboard cutout things, and even the teachers showed up in headdresses, and some of the parents would show up in garb, and it was really interesting. But they are not exposed to the type of conversations we're having here. But in the classroom, intimately asking the kids about their experience and their knowledge of Native Americans and our histories, they know more than our kids here know, even in Montana. And that's really interesting, knowing how important Indian education for all is supposed to be versus going to another country to find that their kids know more than our kids, and even more than our kids in our communities know about overall Indian history.
You know, I'm thinking back to when I would describe myself as a lifelong artist. My mom, who's Greek, she was a classically trained artist in watercolor and tempera, doing iconography and that type of thing. So from very young, I was exposed to art in the home. And but you know, I was thinking back, the first piece my mom ever framed for me was something I'd done on notebook paper, and it was a horse. I still have it somewhere. But yeah, so I can trace my roots back that far. But no, I didn't get into ledger art though. Actually, you know, even really aware of it until maybe 2000. Well, I shouldn't say aware of it, but not really aware of it with my art until about 2013, I would say, when I did some legal work for a ledger artist friend of mine, and you know, we got to talking about art, and he said, you know, I showed him some of my things. He said, well, I gotta get you some ledger paper because you got to start putting this on ledger because your style would, you know, fit within that. So
Is that Monty Yellowbird?
yeah, Monty.
Monty Yellowbird is another amazing ledger artist, folks.
Yeah, an incredible artist, and just an incredible person. You know, very generous and traditional person, and so you know that's how I got my start. So yeah, I have what I could call a ledger piece from when I was young, but it wasn't really on my radar.
Yeah, just to that same thing, like Evan said, he's always been an artist. I think any artist that I rub elbows with has always been an artist, and it's largely a part of, at least me, my family, our family, of who we are. Like, personally, my mother, she's been an artist for a lot of years, but an educator at the same time. Everybody in my family has made things from time to time for our culture, for our celebrations, for ceremonies, etc., for their careers. My grandfather, my grandmother was a photographer for 70 plus years. And we have volumes and volumes and volumes of photographs, thousands of photographs in our family home. And beyond that, my great-grandfather and great-grandmothers, they all made things. My great-grandfather, Ben Pease Sr., he was a maker of things, and they titled him an art of faker in the anywhere from the 30s all the way to the 60s. He was making things, and sometime before that. And he's collected by all these private collections whose huge collections are now in museums like the Denver Art Museum and the Buffalo Bill Cody Center of the West, etc. So, and my great-grandmother, her works are in the same places, and so they're collected by these institutions, and they're in more museums than my work is in. But they were making things to support their family because that's all they could do, because there's no jobs, you know, where they lived. There was no way to support their families. And their parents and their parents were all makers of beautiful things. So I think it's a part of who we are because we're not too far removed from making beautiful things for our humanness.
Excellent.
Adrian.
I have a question. And it a little bit speaks to how we tend to only emphasize natives or like the Germans or like you were saying then. But it's also, there's something going on with ledger art where there is the storytelling that the native artist is making on top of, they're documenting something on top of colonial documents. So there's an irony there of this layering of one document on top of another. And historians, art historians, from what I've read, tend to read into that a certain maybe empowerment for very disenfranchised people. And I just wondered if you could speak to that. I think as an artist, there's an empowerment just to making art and telling your story. But is there something more going on there because it's on top of this colonial ledger?
Well, I guess speaking to my own art, not all of my art is done on old ledger, right? Colonial ledger. I've done a number of pieces on vintage BIA publications, and so you know, but still, even with modern paper that's being used in contemporary ledger art, you know, I guess there has to be some empowerment there, right? Because yeah, we're taking something, especially like when I think of like the BIA paper that I've worked on. BIA is one of the most frustrating agencies in my own personal work to deal with. It can be anyway. There's a lot of good people there as well, but you know, it can be very frustrating to deal with that bureaucracy. And I think so. You know, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a piece I did called "Sit, Stay, Roll Over, Play Dead," and it was titled "Indian Education," right? And so, but so to me, it was taking that art and that message of, you know, Indian education that was provided by the BIA through the 70s, before there was this educational resurgence where people reclaimed that role of being the educator. You know, so to me, it was empowering to put that content on this BIA paper.
Do you think it was empowering as in Silky in 1880, in the 1880s?
It's so hard to guess at what
Or were
they
they
might
just,
have been.
or they just, it was the only thing they had because they no longer had eyes?
Yeah, like for example, there was an officer. He was called Officer Pratt, and he oversaw a number of individuals who were prisoners of war, technically, at a Fort Marion, and he willfully gave them these booklets, these little ledger booklets, so that they could catalog their memories from where they came from for the life that they used to live. And so that they did. And they just did that because that's what they had. They were prisoners. They were passing time, right, in Florida. And that just continued. You know, it had been happening a little bit, and it just continued because paper was among one of the most valuable resources with the coming of the West, right? What are some other valuable resources? Food items, right? Tools, steel, right? Ways to make life easier. And those things all came and found their ways into our culture, right? Tendrils were sprouting everywhere. And tonight, you know, I drive here in a brand new Ford, and I have a newest brand new iPhone in my pocket. And I feel empowered because there are these forms of technology that I get to use, but I don't feel like, anti-colonial, F the man, you know, because I make something on my iPhone. But at the same time, there is this sort of cultural juxtaposition that you're talking about that can be empowering if you employ that, right? It's about intention. It's about, you know, just making a message, right? Adaptation, culture adaptation, right? The horse. You could talk a lot about the horse and its entry into our peoples, you know.
Yeah, can I just say something about that super quickly? Some of the research that I came across while working on this project talked about just the very act. There's the myth of the vanishing Indian, right? You mentioned earlier, and then Colonel Pratt having them make the drawings to sort of capture.
He was an officer at the time, not colonel yet.
He wasn't an officer. No, when he was in Fort Marion. Are you busting on colonels? But but the colonial project as such can't stand things that aren't in the right place, or if they exist at all. And so in the effort to wipe out the Indian, they were being recorded at the same time, and so just their very existence, even on the paper, was an act of resistance and survival in a way. Even though the people making the drawings weren't necessarily intending that. It's kind of an abstract thought. I just wanted to share that that's something I came across in my research.
Yeah, this Officer Pratt was the same guy who led an initiative for education for Indians, the education of the Indian. And his famous saying is, kill the Indian and save the man. And he headed like Carlisle Indian School. And I mean, it's more in the headlines now, but he wanted to take away the culture from the Indian, you know, take away the horse, take away the practice, the culture, the religion, the spirituality, everything, and then reinstall what the white man was, you know, send them to school. So our great grandmother was in the inaugural class for Colonel Pratt, and she was sent to the East Coast, and from the time she was 9 years old to the time she was like 25 or something. Sarah Walker was her name. And she was then taken under the wing of some individuals who owned Waldorf Astoria. And so she was there for a spell, and then she came home. But before coming home, she disenrolled herself from her tribe so that she could not only be a citizen, but own a business. You know, being non-Indian had more power than being an Indian because you weren't really a human yet, give or take. And so after she came home, she was very instrumental in starting the day school on our reservation, so that kids were no longer had to be taken away from their families, taken out of their community, and stripped of their identity and their humanness. And it's a really, really interesting story, and to think about just opining on her thought process as a young lady, as finding a new world somewhere else and learning all these things, and learning that she wasn't worth as much as the lady next to her who had lighter colored skin. And then coming home and making a change, a veritable change, mind you. And that day school led to the founding of many other day schools on our reservation and on other reservations. And imagine keeping kids with their families in their home. Oh man, it's a lot. It's heavy to think about, but yeah. What were we talking about?
Was she able to do that because she had given up her status as a tribesperson?
She was.
So it was like, it was an empowerment, oddly.
It was an empowerment.
It was an empowerment.
But now I'm less Indian on paper. You know, my pedigree is much less than what it should be. And so I can only be enrolled certain places. I went to the park the other day, Yellowstone, and they said, "Do you have your tribal ID card?" And I forgot my pedigree card, I said.
Yeah. Any other questions? Wow. You guys, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thank you to you guys. We'll get you guys on the road here so you can get home. Get some rest before going back to work tomorrow.
Back to work.
Yeah.
Some of us.
Some of us.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you for making the trip.